there's something oddly reassuring about how bad most of us are at predicting the future. 25 years ago, I was an innocent kid exploring a relatively new internet through an old dial-up modem. For me, at least, all these connections were pure excitement and possibility. I was blissfully unaware of the vast changes and controversies they'd bring. Looking at my own 10-month-old today, I realized that about the only thing I can predict is that he'll consider dial-up modems, and probably me too, to be about as relevant as an ancient Greek chariot. But for just a moment here, I want to try to see the world through the eyes of someone else who, unlike me, was deeply worried about the effects of new technology. This someone was a keen observer of how technology shapes the world around us. They saw people using it to gain personal and political power in ways that weren't always truthful. They noticed us being more obstinate than ever, just clinging to our own opinions, not even considering the other side. And they were keenly aware that ideas are now being spread at an ever more blistering pace. Because of all this, the person I have in mind was deeply worried about the effects on our ability to have a real conversation with each other. Now you might be thinking, okay, we've heard these concerns before. But what you might not know is that they've been around for a bit longer than you might expect. This person wasn't talking about Twitter or Facebook. They weren't a pioneering computer scientist or a cognitive psychologist. It was the philosopher Plato. And what he was worried about over 2,500 years ago was this new technology of writing. Now, as a philosopher myself, I'm very grateful that Plato wrote down his concerns about writing. Otherwise, we wouldn't have access to them today. And I should say, while Plato's solution is going to be about encouraging conversation, if you ever need to end a conversation, just try announcing, "I'm a philosopher." I found that works pretty well. But Plato really is fascinating, not just for the surprising relevance of what he has to say, but for the creative way that he says it. So today, I'd like to walk through 3 of Plato's stories with you that really highlight the challenges that new technology brings. Its tendency to trade in reasoning for convenience, its dependence on just a single viewpoint, and its emphasis on speed. Let's start with speed. This is a familiar aspect of our world today. Everything needs to be available in an instant and broadcast in real time. But Plato thought that speed has its drawbacks, especially when it comes to something like writing. Think of, say, just reading a written essay as opposed to having a conversation. When reading, it's easy just to skim through and think you're done. The back and forth of conversation tends to take a little more time, but it can really also lead to deeper engagement. Plato uses a really neat image to drive this point home. He likens the way that we approach writing to gardens of Adonis. These were part of a yearly ritual that the Greeks used to commemorate the famed lover of Aphrodite who had an all too short life. What they would do is they would plant seeds in these shallow pot shards, and they'd force them to sprout in just a few days. The result was this beautiful bed of lush green leaves. But soon, those plants would wither from their shallow roots. So the Greeks would just take them down to the coast and ritually cast them into the waves. Now, Plato isn't saying that these little gardens are entirely useless. In a way, the whole point is that they're temporary, beautiful one moment, and then gone the next. But make no mistake, they're not designed for, nor will they provide, long-lasting sustenance. I have to say, I can't help but imagine how odd it must have been to watch people rushing these shallow little gardens just to toss them into the sea. But at the same time, I can't help but wonder, if Plato could watch us today posting to social media, would he see it any differently? If he was worried about the speed of writing, what does that tell us about our on-demand culture today? Now, his concerns about speed have to do partly with this second point, about the difficulty of truly engaging with other perspectives. Plato talks of how speech, once written down, simply wanders around saying the same things over and over again. If you already agree, you aren't likely to learn anything new. If you don't, it's easiest just to ignore it. This brings us to a second story that he uses about the Egyptian gods meeting to discuss the merits of writing. The inventor of writing is, of course, very excited. He presents his wares to the king of the gods and tells him, "I have discovered a potion for memory and for wisdom." But the god king isn't convinced. He says that writing will actually instill forgetfulness and give people the false sense of thinking that they know when they actually don't. Just think, for example, of how few phone numbers we can recite today now that they're all stored in our smartphones. Now, it's easy to think here, okay, got it. Obviously, inventor of writing thinks it's good, but the wise god king shows that it's bad. But more's going on here than meets the eye. According to Plato, the king had good things to say about writing too. Plato just doesn't tell us what they were. And he's presenting us with criticism after criticism of writing in the form of a written dialogue. Surely he doesn't think writing's all bad. Now, this brings us to one more point, that Plato actually found this really creative way to create writings while still preserving the benefits of conversation. We call them dialogues because they depict a thorough discussion that genuinely takes multiple perspectives seriously. Instead of simply announcing these benefits to us, Plato shows us through the way that he crafts these written dialogues. If he could do it for writing, in writing, despite all of his concerns about writing, how might that translate to our context today? How can we preserve the benefits of dialogue while still engaging with modern technology? Okay, so Plato has one more story for us. This one has to do about the importance of reason. Plato tells us that the most valuable thing you could get your hands on in ancient times was one of these mythical statues of Daedalus. They were so skillfully made, so lifelike in their design, that they actually moved. But even if you were able to get your hands on one and, say, took it on home, the minute you weren't looking, that statue might just move on over to some other person's yard. Turns out, they're not going to retain their value unless you have some way of tying them down. Plato stresses that we need to tie down our ideas, too, with the underlying reason that motivates them. Otherwise, they too will get away from us, just like one of those elusive statues. Now, part of Plato's concern here is that sometimes we have this false impression, say just liking a quote will get us out of the hard work of truly understanding it. There's this seductive idea that even philosophy culminates with some pithy statement, something just so true it exudes wisdom. But even the people we like to quote most, they have a whole body of work to back up what they're saying. So similarly, modern shortcuts like hashtags, they're great at collecting information, giving a quick read on where someone stands, but they're not so great at communicating the underlying motivation. We have to ask ourselves for any given claim, what's going to tie down that idea? Why should we support it? What's the evidence? Now, I want to take just one more moment here to appreciate how uncanny it is that these concerns from well over 2,000 years ago can still speak to us today. That's not to say that all of our problems have been solved. For all their inventions, the Greeks never even figured out how to make clothing with pockets. But it is to say we need to think hard about how technology impacts our most deeply held values. We need to continue that dialogue that Plato started for us so many years ago. When we do, we should remember that technology is a tool for crafting our own intricate statues, and that they retain their value when grounded in what we really care about. We need to work on including different perspectives, just like that Egyptian god king. Rather than meaning that we've got something wrong, exploring both sides is more often a sign that we're really doing something right. And not everything can serve its purpose in an instant, like those beautiful gardens of Adonis. But changes that come about more slowly often bear the greatest fruit. New technologies are inevitable. so it would be pointless to insist on ritually casting them into the sea. But Plato's challenge is for us to keep finding new ways to enable and encourage this old technology of conversation, ways that retain those core values of reason, of patience, and of open-mindedness. Thank you.